right. I think people will continue to join in as we go, but this is a good time to start. Hello, everyone. I hope my microphone is unmuted. Yes, it is. Thank you all for joining us today for the Saudi Transport webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you might be. Welcome. Thanks for being here for this webinar, the topic for which is the future of traffic and intercity travel in line with the Saudi Transport, Traffic and Logistics exhibition by the Riyadh Exhibition Company. First and foremost, thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of this webinar. My name is Mahyar Ibrahimi. I'm the conference director for the Saudi Transport Conference, and I'll be your host and moderator for this afternoon's session. I would especially like to thank our panelists for being here with us today. Now, of course, I'll give them plenty of time to speak and introduce themselves, but just to let you know who we have with us here today, we have with us Professor Derek Woodgate, President and Chief Futurist at the Future Labs USA, Harj Dhaliwal, Managing Director, Middle East and India at the Virgin Hyperloop, Dr. Mohammed Farhan, Saudi Aramco Chair Professor and Director of the Intelligent Transportation System, Smart Mobility and Traffic Safety Research at Imam Abdul Rahman bin Faisal University in the Kingdom. And of course, last but not least, Helmut Scholz, Partner at A.T. Kearney Middle East. Now, as I said, I'll give them plenty of time to introduce themselves, but first, a few house rules, if you will, to guide our discussion and make sure that you can make the most of the Zoom platform today. If at any point during the webinar you have any technical difficulties or have any questions regarding the Zoom platform or other webinars, you can ask these to myself and my team privately using the Q&A function, which is in the bottom middle of your screen if you're viewing us from a computer, or it's one of the buttons if you're seeing us from a mobile phone. Please bear in mind that all attendee microphones and webcams are disabled during the webinar, and you will only hear and see from the panelists and myself. So again, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function. But of course, you'll also have some questions that you would like to put to the panel that we will answer throughout this discussion live. You can again use the same Q&A function to put these forward. Just do mention who you'd like the questions to be answered by, if it's a specific panelist or if it's to the full panel, we can do that as well. And throughout the discussion, at a few different points, what we'll do is we'll take a few minutes from the structured questions and we'll answer these live questions accordingly. Finally, a small favor to ask. Once we are done with the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a 30-second survey to let us know how you found the webinar today and what the experience was. Please do take the time to answer these. It goes a long way in helping us prepare for this and future webinars. Now, with that, let's get all the speakers in. Michelle, if you can enable everyone's cams. So enough from me. Let's give each of the speakers the time to introduce themselves. Professor Woodgate, we'll start from you if you'd like to say hello. And
yes, certainly. Hi, good afternoon, I suppose, to everybody. I'm in Croatia on the seaside, so slightly different time scale. So I'm, as you mentioned, the President and Chief Futurist at the Futures Lab. We've been going since 1996, based out of the US, but of course we're everywhere. I also teach at the University of Houston in the US and at the University of Agder in Norway. And I'm a board member or executive board member on the Center for Future Studies at the University of Dubai. As far as transportation is concerned, so actually in all those universities, I actually do teach the future of mobility, energy, and sustainability, as well as the science of foresight. So about transportation, I was an advisor to the US government and to Congress on the future of infrastructure 2050, between 2014 and 2016. And other than that, I've done a lot on smart roads. I've done a lot of work for specific cities, particularly Austin, Texas, Kuala Lumpur, and a few others on smart cities, and also with the major architectural companies like Arup and Gensler and people like that on smart cities specifically. So that's my claim to fame or otherwise, should we say.
Definitely not otherwise. Definitely plenty of fame and an impressive resume, of course. Dr. Farhan, would you like to say a few words and give us your hellos? I think you are muted. I'll just unmute you, Doctor. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Mayar. Good afternoon, everybody. I am currently affiliated with the Saudi Aramco Chair for Traffic Safety Research. I am heading the applied safety research work here. And apart from that, I also teach at Imam Abdul Rahman bin Faisal University at College of Engineering at the Transportation Engineering Department. Before joining here, I was affiliated with the Federal Highway Administration funded agency, Transportation Planning Agency, for about over 15 years in USA, where we were conducting metropolitan planning and regional transportation planning for many areas of different states. Apart from that, I've also been a member of a Transportation Demand Management Committee, a standing committee on transportation demand management at TRB, which is precisely AE50, and also involved in many applied research activities here in Saudi Arabia. At Aramco Chair specifically, I'll be very quick and so that others could introduce now. I will specifically mention the safety research projects, which we are trying to put a dent into, which is a bigger issue in Saudi Arabia now, given the circumstances. So we have been, for the last 10 years, we've been conducting a lot of traffic safety research and smart mobility integration research, which could help relieve the traffic safety and mobility situation in Saudi Arabia. I have also conducted a lot of consulting work for many regional transportation agencies, federal agencies in America, including Federal Highway Administration, FDA, and also for other states like for government of Pakistan and many other countries in Europe. That will be all. If you have any questions later on, you guys can contact me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Farhan. Harj, I'll go to you next if you'd like to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, for inviting me to the conference and the webinar today. Hello, everyone. My name is Harj Daliwal. I'm the Managing Director of Virgin Hyperloop One for the Middle East and India. I've been with Virgin Hyperloop now since 2017. In fact, I was working with Virgin Hyperloop back in 16, end of 16, when they first came into the region here and established the offices. Prior to joining Virgin Hyperloop, I've had over 35 years of experience working in infrastructure, transportation, mainly since 95 on metros, railways and high-speed railways in Europe, predominantly the UK, Ireland. And in effect, what I've been doing since then has also gone into working with contractors, consultants, with clients. So I would say a third of my time has been involved in each area. More recently, since joining Virgin Hyperloop and having delivered some major transport programs. The program before coming to before coming to Virgin was with Etihad Rail, where we delivered 268 kilometers of railway in just over 3.5 years using ETCS level 2 technology, digital railway signaling technology here in the region. So I have a track record of working in traditional forms of transport, mass transport, as well as now looking towards the future of transportation and where that's heading. So it's exciting times, very, very proud to be a part of that. And I look forward to the webinar and the questions later on today.
Thanks, Arjun. We'll definitely delve deeper into what's been happening at Virgin Hyperloop as well. But Helmut, I'd like to give you the chance as well to say a few words before we get started.
Thank you very much, Maya. Yeah, my name is Helmut Scholz. I'm a partner at A.T. Kearney in the Middle East, co-leading our transportation and infrastructure practice. I've been in the region now since more than 12 years, and I've been supporting a multitude of clients across a broad spectrum of projects that involved almost all modes of transportation, which we're going to cover today. Particularly in the last 5 years, that space has become very, very interesting in terms of future mobility solutions. And I'm actually quite pleased that we have the chance today to jointly talk about that. Aside from my involvement as a consultant, I'm also quite actively involved in the startup scene in the Middle East. I'm a co-founder of Dubai Angel Investors. That's a member-led VC network that focuses on investing in regional startups, which amongst others, of course, also focus on developing mobility solutions of the future. Great pleasure to be here today, and hope we have a great time and interactive time with the audience.
Glad to have you with us. Glad to have all of you with us. And with that, let's get started. Let's go right into the main discussion points. Now, for those of you who were with us in the last webinar, we discussed the impacts and importance of technology for the entire transportation sector. We talked about exciting technologies like AI and big data and what those actually mean for the sector at large. And of course, we talked in quite a bit of detail on the significance that all of this will have for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, especially with Vision 2030 and the ambitious plans that are going to be essentially coming to fruition in the coming years. For today's session, we'll be talking essentially more in depth and sort of a deep dive on intercity travel and traffic. We'll be talking about data and the role it plays in everything to do with traffic and intercity travel. We'll be talking about some of the up and coming modes of transportation and new types of getting around, if you will, within cities and intercity travel, of course. And of the most important part of this, we'll talk about how this all affects the kingdom. We'll talk about what we need to do within the kingdom to incentivize the use of public transportation and sustainable modes of transportation while we get to these sort of up and coming technologies. Again, we'll get into all of that shortly. But to start things off, let's talk about data. Whether we're talking about the existing infrastructure of transportation today, or we're talking about how this can be augmented in future technologies using data, we have to always have some kind of look at the data and what it means. Data, of course, is multifaceted, whether we're talking about gathering data, we're talking about monitoring and analyzing it, we're talking about visualizing it, or we're talking about actually utilizing it on its own or within an autonomous system. All of these things play a role, and how they integrate amongst each other also plays a very integral role. So with that, all of that being said, given the varied perspectives here, I'd like to go to Derek first to get your insights. Again, having worked across the board with all of these things and with data as on its own, and getting the chance to see some exciting data from your work in recent years. What are your thoughts on this? What's the importance of data? What can it achieve in making all of these visions a reality?
Good question. Big question. Since data is everything, right? I mean, more or less, because we've begun to, actually, it's not everything because we still have a lot of hardware. But I suppose if the intent is to move towards seamless mobility, whether it is 2030, 2040, or whenever it ultimately occurs, data is probably one of the most critical aspects of that, right? I mean, because we spend, in fact, a considerable amount of time talking about all the modes of transportation, you know, all the types. So if anyone wants to run down a list, what are the technologies? You know, we can run down a list of 20 new technologies and a list of 22 types of vehicles that are all being developed. But the interconnectivity that's required for pulling all this together is going to be one of the most critical aspects. We can't actually have smart cities operating or smart transportation systems operating without data, obviously. And I think that one of the key aspects here of the interoperability of all this, where, you know, really we're looking at infrastructure, vehicles, roads, you know, smart cities, and all the aspects coming together, the interfaces that connect that, and the issues with security and safety that connect those interfaces is really one of the most critical points here. So the more we have interoperability between systems, the more problems we have with security of those systems. And security of those systems are incredibly important. And I don't mean just now security from the perspective of, you know, terrorist attack or something bad happening in that way, but security of, not even hacking, although that is obviously an initial thing, but simply them functioning as a unified system, right? That's part of the critical thing here. And so, yeah, we can talk, you know, for hours about the importance of IoT and IoTT and IONT, you know, Internet of Nanotech things, and how they're going to bring, and kinetic buildings, and how all this works together. And yeah, it's all data driven, and they're all data interfaces that are interconnected. But at the end of the day, unless we have an overall network system that really understands how to pull this data together in a smart way that's actually functioning, you know, where it's all functioning and harmonized, then each individual part of this system is not really as optimized as it needs to be. So from that perspective, that's how I look at data. And I think some of you know that I am a consultant to the Minister of the Interior in the Emirates, specifically actually on different areas, but traffic and transportation. And of course, there's some of the major things we're looking at, safety. And you know, I mean, if you really go back to what people want from transportation, it's ease and comfort, right, principally. And I think that if we're going to bring in all these autonomous systems, if we're going to bring in new modes of transportation, then that connectivity is critical here. And it's even more critical as we move towards self-directed intelligence, right, which actually takes decisions, looks at the analytics, and then takes decisions on what should happen, whether that's letting people through, you know, whether it's a vehicle interacting with the other parts of the system to let people through at intersections, whether it's, you know, fully streamlined traffic light systems working together, whether it's, well, I'll come back to maybe later on what we call spatial narratives, which is the layering of the sky for all these, you know, types of vehicles that we expect to see, aerial vehicles that we expect to see. You know, all this is interconnected and needs to work seamlessly if we're really to optimize these systems. That's my two.
Perfect. We'll definitely tap in. You put in quite a few different interesting points that we'll get into. But I want to bring in Dr. Farhan first to share your thoughts, Doctor, especially given your expertise both outside the kingdom and now within the kingdom. What do you think about data, the gathering, the utilizing, and all the other aspects of it?
Look, thanks for this question. It is a very important one in the perspective of the transformation we are envisioning here in Saudi Arabia and all over the world, actually. Look, I envision platforms developing or evolving out of multifaceted data spheres. I believe that there are many data spheres that in future that will be working. And as mentioned before, I think these spheres, if they do not talk to each other, if they are not connected to each other, they will not work. For instance, the first thing that comes to my mind is on-demand mobility sphere, where we have mobility as a service. We have intermodal technologies envisioned. They will be working together. So unless they are interconnected with each other using sound data frameworks, they will not work. And that's very important in terms of data. The second sphere that I envision is the overall transformation sphere, which is important because if we use these data spheres in silos and develop them in silos where they are not integrated with each other, they will not work. For instance, the example of overall ITS or connected infrastructure. If this connected infrastructure, connected vehicle infrastructure, you may call it that way, if it is not connected with the properly structured traffic flow data framework, it will not work. So these data frameworks, data spheres, whatever we could call them, they have to be connected. That is the first thing. The other sphere, which is important one and often neglected, is public health sphere. Often we traffic engineers or mobility engineers, we are too much focused on vehicles, autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles, but the social aspect of traffic safety side is a missing piece. So that has to be connected. Though that sphere has to be connected to this as well. For instance, in the current state of affairs, even many developed countries, they don't have integrated mortality data registry system with their traffic flow systems. So we can envision all of these data sets to be there. We can envision IoT, we can envision autonomous vehicles working, having their fair share in the system in future. But without properly structured data spheres and interfaces, we will not be able to achieve much. I am afraid, actually, as a student of mobility science, I'm afraid that at this point in time, we still do not understand the data sets properly. We do not understand what these data are telling us, and what are their merits and what are their demerits. How they can be exploited, and maybe in some cases how dangerous they could be in terms of security, in terms of social issues. So in my opinion, their integration, the data integration, proper framework, and um, and ensuring that these frameworks are communicating with each other is the most important thing as we go through this transformation. And if I have a little bit of time left, I may talk about Saudi Arabia a little bit. In current state, Saudi Arabia is envisioning through Vision 2030 a lot of promising technologies to be deployed. But if you ask me as a professor, I can, or a researcher, I can tell you that we need a lot of other initiatives to support the deployment of these technologies. For example, we do not have a single smart mobility lab in Saudi Arabia right now. That's a fact. So we need some test bed labs where we could deploy these technologies. We can test these technologies. We need integrated infrastructure earmarking, where we, and later on, maybe I can talk about that in more details, where we can earmark some of these projects, some of these initiatives in our planning processes. Our planning processes in Saudi Arabia are, we do talk about in communiques, in brochures, in many branding videos about these projects. But when we look at our initial planning processes, like long range plans, regional plans, our regional plans are missing these technologies. So that needs to happen. I can talk about it more later on. Thank you.
Definitely. We will definitely touch more on this as we go throughout the discussion. But you brought a good few points up that I want to sort of expand on with Harj here. Harj, not just data as well, but sharing data, being able to use the data that some people have and others obviously don't have access to is a key part. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, both professors have hit on so many points, and my head's exploding a little bit as to where I should start. But I think we've got to go back to basics, and isn't it amazing, right, that we as the human race have come so far in transportation, the way we have using what we've got. I mean, what I mean by that is, and I'm sort of not being elusive, but what does that mean? I mean, we all drive around independently. Every car we get into, every vehicle, it's independent. It's driven by a human. And to enable us to have millions of trips made a year and come so far without everyone clashing into each other and missing each other, it's absolutely a phenomenon. How have we done it, right? But we have. So I think I want to start off by sort of just bringing that out. And why have I said that? Because it is about integration. And both professors have been very clear that, you know, as we move forward, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? Well, really, it's about people. It's about passengers. It's about the future and the experience and the needs of the passenger. How is that going to be affected using technology and data? And I think that is where it's really coming to the fore. And it's about choice. You know, in this day and age, with the technology that now we've got available to us, why are we still being driven by timetables? And again, I think Professor Woodgate mentioned, you know, it is about on demand. I think Professor Farhan also mentioned, it's about being on demand. And when you want anything that's on demand, it requires a huge amount of data in real time. And this is the other bit I'm going to come to. Yeah, data delayed means nothing. It's not useful. It just gives you a bit of a prediction. But in real time, now you are able to harness the advantages of it. And what you mean by that then is you are actually giving choice. You are enabling people to travel when they want, where they want, how they want. And I think that is the future I think we're actually alluding to. And more importantly, I think when we then start looking at the different modes of transport that are available, I think transport's been fantastic in siloing itself up until now. And what I mean by that is trains, planes, automobiles, shipping, all separated. And it's been fantastic for the manufacturers. It's been great. And then we now have smart cities laid over all of this. And how are we going to continue in the future? Well, again, we need data. We need to be able to integrate using smart cities and creating platforms that enable us to actually bring all of this together, to enable us to give choice, to enable us to drive efficiency. And it then comes back into the environment and sustainability. So I'm going to hit on that point at the same time, because it is about ultimately being efficient, it's about being effective, and then it's about being affordable to the masses. And I think that is where I think we start to get it's a step change in the way we view going forward. The ability to make mass transport integrated and affordable. And I will leave you with this thought. What is the role of manufacturers, transportation manufacturers like automotive manufacturers in the future? Are they going to continue just developing cars to sell to the masses? Or are they going to start using their technologies into a much more integrated platform and almost look at mobility as a service as the way forward for them? And I'm going to sort of kick that out there, because I think that is so important, because all the big manufacturers are looking at where is personal transport heading? Where is it going? And I think through integration, it's more about providing a service. If you look at the millennials now coming through, ownership is not of concern any longer. The ability to be able to travel when they want at an affordable price is of a key issue to them. So it's not about buying a car and owning a car, for example. It's actually it's having access to that car. And how does that affect smart cities, and how will we manage those in the future? And I think these are all great questions. Finally, I think I'm just going to come back onto data. Data is fine if you can get hold of it. I think the ability to be able to get data, what do? We need masses of data. And we are sitting here in the UAE where probably there is more data available on transport than anywhere else in the world. I think we need to work with governments and authorities, with developers like ourselves, to really access and harness that data to enable us to build these transport platforms of the future.
I think you set the stage perfectly for Helmut as well here to jump in. Having consulted both governments and private stakeholders, what are your thoughts on data, Helmut?
I think it's clear also, all of the predecessors already made it clear. If IT is the motor, data is the fuel. That's pretty clear. That is key for anything. It's not about the hardware, the cars, the buses, etc. Data plays a role across multiple dimensions, right? I mean, if you just look at a few points, very tangible examples. On a customer end, how do I design a product, a service, a transportation service to a customer without understanding his needs, right? How do I actually have a let's say, smooth and seamless ticketing solution without data? So moving from paper tickets to account-based ticketing. How do I actually make sure that a customer has a convenient experience getting into a e-hailing service car and then getting out without even touching anything, but just pushing maybe one button? All that is driven by data. It's also about the efficiency of the services, right? How do I want to know where do I position my taxis, my limousines, etc., without understanding data patterns? How can I avoid traffic? How do I direct traffic? So intelligent transport systems and all kind of traffic management relies heavily on data. It's also important for the operators. How do I want to understand how to save costs? Data can help me massively in terms of maintenance and operations, right? It plays a role throughout the whole spectrum. And as such, it's very clear that this is a core item. A very interesting aspect, which we haven't fully touched upon yet, I think came out in the last comments by Harj, is who owns the data? That's a very interesting question. And that's also one which will be, which is controversial, let's put it this way, right? In let's say, my work, I've seen, let's say, several negotiations, discussion happening about who ultimately has that access. I think there's different aspects of that. There's one side, of course, protection of, let's say, the access to the customer. On the other side, from a government perspective, the interest should be to have a as broadly as possible available data platform in order to improve the efficiency overall of the system, right? The more efficient transport you have, the less individual traffic and the more utilized mass transit you have, the better for your city, right? In an environment where 70% of the population will live in cities by 2050, you need to also think about that from a government perspective. Yeah, so that's an interesting discussion and an interesting controversy happening on the one side between the government from a regulatory side, different public transport operators, and as well as private transport operators. That is to be seen where this leans towards in the future.
Great. Perfect. I wish we could talk more about data. To be honest, I wish we had an entire webinar just focused on data. I feel like everybody here would have been perfectly happy with that too. But we do want to talk about transportation as a whole. So let's move on to the next topic. Just a quick reminder for the audience, you can ask us your questions and we will be answering these in the next few minutes. So just start asking these in the Q&A function. We will get to them. But I want to move to the next segment or point of discussion, which is the future of transportation. So we talked a bit about some of the new and exciting technologies. Obviously, electric and efficient vehicles are gaining a lot of popularity these days, and they're all the craze with sustainable movement and mobility. But of course, a lot of people say the future of cars is actually autonomous and self-driving vehicles rather than electric vehicles, or some combination thereof. I'm sure some people on the panel would argue. Beyond cars, Virgin Hyperloop just had a groundbreaking and successful test of their pods, I think just over a week ago, that we will definitely touch into now. But that has potential massive breakthroughs for mass transit as a whole. And of course, even moving beyond the ground altogether, we have some of the drone taxis that have been tested by the RTA in the UAE, and potentially, as a distinct possibility in the future, we might have our very own flying cars. Again, not sure how long that will take, but it is a possibility. So with all of these different types of technologies being possible, let's dive deeper into what each of you thinks is coming, what each of you thinks is going to be the most popular, or potentially if you think they will all sort of coexist in a real smart mobility system that just has an aspect of all of these, whether personal or otherwise vehicles, mass transit, and flying cars and whatnot. So Harj, I'll go to you first if you want to talk a bit about the recent test from Virgin Hyperloop 1 and what that could mean for the future of mass transit.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Look, I'm going to go back to when I first joined Virgin Hyperloop and why did I join? I left a career building traditional forms of transport, and now we are looking at the future and what is developing. I mean, Hyperloop technology, for those who are not really fully aware of it, it's a crossover. The way best way to describe it is a crossover between space, aerospace, and high-speed rail engineering. Very simply put, what we do have is that we have a tube, we evacuate the air, we put a vehicle, a pod in that tube, and we levitate that pod in that vacuum environment, and then we propel it. Now, when you're in a semi-vacuum environment, there is very little resistance to the vehicle, and we're able to actually travel at very high speeds with very, very low consumption of energy in a nutshell. But more importantly, what we're able to do and what we are focused on doing is creating a mass transport system which gives choice, but it's on demand, direct to destination, and it ties in with everything that we've just discussed with respect to the passenger experience, turn up and go, high capacity. And more importantly, what does it do? It uses a lot less energy, and that enables us to then start looking at alternative, viable, sustainable solutions. And ultimately, the way we view Hyperloop is that in regions like the Middle East and India, where I'm predominantly working, we could actually have mass transport systems that rely predominantly off-grid. That means they generate their own energy sources. And what we mean by that is when you look at linear systems like a Hyperloop, which runs for hundreds of kilometers, and you are now looking at very advanced photovoltaics, which we can actually wrap around a lot of the infrastructure that we build, then the energy that generates over those distances is enough to power the system in its own right, certainly during off-peak use, and ultimately be able to produce enough energy that will actually be a net positive contributor into the society or the grid, for a better word. So that's what ultimately we're trying to achieve. At the moment, what we are doing is this. We are looking at a system that needs to integrate with other forms of transport. And we're looking at micromobility, we're looking at last mile providers. And that, you know, our technology, we've progressed since 17 when we first conducted our tests in a vacuum environment. We actually put a full-scale vehicle through. And the most common question we had was, when are people going to be traveling on that system? Well, the culmination of the last 2 years was a week and a half ago when we were able to safely put passengers, some of our team, into our facility outside Nevada and prove to the world that actually not only can you have full-scale Hyperloop vehicles operating, but they can operate safely with passengers. So that was a milestone event for us. And what we're now doing is engaging with authorities right around the globe, predominantly in the US and West Virginia, where we did a deal very recently to open up a Hyperloop certification test facility. We are working very, very closely with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Ministry of Transport, the TGA, and the big projects like NEOM, Qiddiya, and the Red Sea to enable to understand how connectivity is going to work across that region by 2030. And here in the UAE, we are very closely looking at technology, very focused on developing, in partnership with Abu Dhabi, AI technology. We signed an MOU with the first AI university in the world, Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence, to jointly start looking at research programs to help us and to help them on understanding how our technology can actually be used in not only Hyperloop, but also adjacencies that we're looking at. And further afield in India, well, we've been working in India for 3 years, and we've done a huge amount of work in developing our concession agreement, which we hope will come to fruition next year, between Mumbai and Pune, one of the most densest commute corridors in the world, where we're looking at over 200 million passenger journeys a year. And that journey time at the moment is about 4 hours, will be condensed into 30 minutes. Now, what does that do? You've got a city in Mumbai of 21 million people. You've got Pune, 145 kilometers away, a city of 7 million, growing to 11 million. What does that do to that dynamic? And this is where I think the future of transport and technologies like ours comes into its own. Because when time and distance is no longer a barrier, how would we plan our cities? And I'll hand over to our panelists on that, because I think that sets the scene up with a bit of intrigue.
Perfectly done. Perfectly done there. Derek, I see you nodding your head if you want to jump in. I know we've talked a lot about future cities and how you want them to be planned. So go ahead.
I don't know how I want them to be planned. They're very complex. particularly my own city, of course, would be perfect and would have Hyperloop. I actually tested Hyperloop in 2017 in Vegas, actually, and I think it's amazing. And I'm super impressed by the amount of progress and development that's happened within those 3 years. That to me, because one of the ones I was testing on really were sort of real test modules. So they looked okay, but they were a little, you know, it was more like a test idea, like a simulator type of idea, but phenomenal. So yeah, personally, I have this sort of massive issue around all this, which is it's called infrastructure. And you know, I look at infrastructure as a combination of physical, virtual, and cognitive, right? So, and we talked about data earlier, but you know, when you come to sort of look at infrastructure today, it can, first of all, data is a big part of that. The hidden parts are just as important as the bits we see, right? And the same with the cognitive part, how we react to all these new things, like traveling at you know, 1,000 miles per hour or whatever. You know, these are critical elements to how, you know, we turn to the future in terms of human adoption of these types of things, and how we're going to deal with. You know, it's all very well to say, you know, by 2030 only electric cars will be on the, you know, produced, as which we've just heard from the UK or whatever. But the reality is, there was a piece of research by McKinsey in 2016. And they looked at US municipalities, the top 68 US municipalities, and found that only 6% of them, rather like Dr. Mohammed was just saying, only 6% of them actually had in their plans any form of these technologies we're talking about, so autonomous vehicles in particular, and only 3% of them had actually heard about them, right? Now, this is pretty troubling, okay? If we're here sitting, and it's our job to talk about all this complexity, you know, in post-normal times of, you know, probably 20 or 30 new formats of transportation, and yet municipalities have not heard of them. So, yeah, they've heard of electric cars. Electric cars, if we go back to 1997, 98, were projected to be about 40% of US vehicles. They're actually around 7%. And it has been growing the last 2 or 3 years. But you have to remember, and this is one of the things that I don't like about forecasting, which is why I'm a futurist, and, is that in the time when they looked at electric cars, we were talking about old style combustion engines. Now we have a completely different format of combustion engine. If we look at all the work that's gone on with tier 3 and tier 4, and which brings me to regulations, because one of the critical things here, that if any of this is going to happen, we need a synchronization of insurance, of regulations, of safety rules, of data standards, of communication protocols. This is a massive process, right? It's a fantastically big process. And, you know, Harj was right in saying, well, you know, maybe we can, you know, go off the grid or have microgrids and do this as a separate entity because it will have a certain role to play. And that's what we're seeing, right? Piloting of each of these things in separate bits. But when you ask me about an integrated system for the future, where all these have to fit together, you know, we haven't even decided yet how autonomous vehicles can be on the road. Yes, we have, you know, lots of test areas, but where will they be? Where would you put them in London, right? You know, you look at London's congestion every single day, despite all the ideas of getting rid of traffic in London. And then you think, where are we going to put them? Well, we can have separate lanes. But all this has to happen over a whole period of time. And I think one of the issues I have is that we're not paying enough attention to the infrastructure story. I mentioned earlier, you actually talked about flying cars. Well, there are lots of flying cars, okay? I mean, there are, but not one of them has yet been approved. There's lots and lots of technologies with you know, vertical takeoff and vertical landing and all the elements that sort of work with flying cars. I mean, I don't know if you know, the SD13, the SD03, the Japanese one, is, you know, is really off the ground now and doing pretty well. Hyundai have the one for Huber elevation. SkyDrive been going for years and still sort of working on them. You know, and you have the technology people like Lilium who've done fantastic work in this area. But at the end of the day, we have no regulations currently, or sensible regulations, that's looking at the future of what we call smart layering for aerial performance. Smart layering is about, you know, societal services, about cyber infrastructures, physical ecosystems, smart security. All these things have to be in place for any of this to work. And so I'm a massive positivist, right? And I would love to say to you that the future city in 2030 or 2040, whatever it's going to be, is going to have all these elements in them, all interconnected. But quite honestly, we're so far away from that. And what I'm looking for is more effort and seeing more real results, not from whether or not we can build, you know, a really good autonomous vehicle, because I know we're going to use them for police. I know we're going to use them, you know, we're seeing buses now and all these areas on tests. But if we're talking about you know, traffic, in city traffic in general, what I want to see is much more work, serious work on infrastructure. Otherwise, I can't really, you know, it's going to take forever for this to happen. I just want to make one last point when I'm talking about that, is because, you know, I think Harj mentioned earlier about sort of new technologies coming in and whatever and changing the debate. Well, they will, right? We've made incredible progress recently on quantum computing, and quantum communications are, you know, are a critical part of this story. If we're really looking at where will infrastructure be in the future, some of the elements of this, like quantum communications and nanosatellites, and the ability and new forms of cryptology which go with that, right? Post-quantum cryptology are going to be some of the critical aspects that you know, that come above this infrastructure that I'm talking about. But I just want to see some early stage real developments where someone can actually tell me today, where are all the autonomous cars that we're planning on having in the market? You know, the projections for the market for autonomous cars by 2050 is $15 trillion. That's a lot of autonomous vehicles. So we have a lot of things to do before we can even think of getting to that point. But it's a great sort of optimism for the future. I'll leave you with that. Sorry.
No, perfect. Perfectly put. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and I do want to get to these, but I want to continue the current segment at least a little further. So, Dr. Farhan, I would love to get your thoughts as well on this. Again, the future of transportation, what you think of these exciting technologies has the most sort of potential, especially within the kingdom?
Thanks for this question. It is another important question, which is in line with the transformation that we are witnessing in Saudi Arabia as well as in the entire world. So look, these technologies are here to stay. These are not going anywhere. Their reality. They are coming loud and clear. But are we prepared for them? As Professor Derek said, that are we ready for these technologies in terms of infrastructure? Are we ready for them in terms of how we're going to utilize them in a sustainable way? In terms of social equity. So that apart, I personally see three sides to this. First is OEM, the manufacturers. All of these projections which I have seen many as well, which are very optimistic, by the way, are mostly coming out of the OEM side, where the developers of these technologies are very optimistic about it, and they are encouraging. It is all good, and they are developing these promising technologies. The second side of this this equation is public stakeholders. How clearly they are envisioning these technologies playing their role in the future. As an example, our regional plans, they are missing these technologies, totally missing. If you look at the 30 years horizon of regional plan, you will be surprised that the same metropolitan planning agencies or ministries elsewhere in the world, not even in Saudi Arabia, but everywhere in the world, you will see that the stakeholders are talking about these technologies, these promising technologies, very good ones. But when you open up their regional planning books, the plans where the money is earmarked, the funding is allocated to future projects. And I'm not talking about, by the way, short-term projects. These are 30-year horizon, a pretty good one, where they could have solid earmarking for any future endeavors. But you would see that they are totally missing these technologies. There are no mentions of connected vehicles in the demands, in the forecast models. There is no mention of autonomous vehicles. You look at the ITS infrastructure, as Professor Derek mentioned, you would see that the infrastructure, ITS, advanced ITS side is missing those pieces, those connectivity, those connected infrastructure elements, they are missing. To the extent I could tell you that most of the metropolitan regions, even in America and as well as in Saudi Arabia, at this point in time, we have fixed traffic controllers. Yeah. I mean, fixed time traffic controllers are good. They are not bad. But if there's a variation in flow in the intermodal, connected intermodal environment, where we have mobility as a service in future, how do you work with those? So that's the basic challenge I see, that the OEMs are promising excellent technologies. But on the other hand, this is a global trend, by the way. You'll find that in Europe as well. Probably it has more to do with resources and allocation of funding. You will see that more and more of these regional transportation plan, they are totally, they are missing these new exciting technologies. So these are the two aspects that we must keep in mind. The other aspect, which is also missing from these autonomous and connected vehicles and other new technologies, which, by the way, I'm a believer that they are helpful, they are good. But if we channel them in the right direction. And the responsibility lies on both OEMs, the manufacturers, as well as the stakeholders. So the third piece, which I feel missing, totally missing in this game is sustainability. Where is the social equity side? Who will be able to afford autonomous vehicle? Who will be able to afford connected vehicles? Will they be affordable? That at the moment, in the next 10 years, I don't see that. And I don't see any infrastructure development or integrated system development where we could make it reach out to common public, where we make them affordable to these public from the social equity side. And from last mile side, as Harsh mentioned, that's another big piece to answer. I don't want to mention many things, but so we go through these research items every day on daily basis, and sometimes we have a brain warp, looking at all the promising information, and then we say, okay, there is one side that is promising so much goodness, and there is another side which is totally silent, so which is a stakeholder side. So I think it is a responsibility of manufacturers of these technologies to kind of maybe train the stakeholders that, look, you just cannot develop these technologies out of thin air and one day you decide that you will be implementing them. You need to have a phased approach, maybe 30 years plan. We need to see that in your plans, and we need to make them sustainable somehow. Only then the whole process will work. And plus what Dr. Derek mentioned, that where is the infrastructure? In 30 years, how do you bring those technologies? And last element, which is the fourth one, by the way, and I'll finish on that. What is the liability? How we are dealing with the liability issue in here, in all of this? I think Professor Derek touched upon this briefly. It is a famous question of liability in the law schools, that if an autonomous vehicle driver is driving and there's a ravine on one side and a pedestrian in front, who will you save? The car driver or the pedestrian? And who is liable for the damage? So that needs to be answered. And this needs to be legislated, not only in developed countries, but other developing countries who have ambition to embrace these technologies. So there are many unknowns, there are many unanswered questions, and I hope that we get there in an integrated fashion, in a sustainable way. And that should be from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farhan. I do want to expand on the sustainability angle, but I just want to get Helmut's thoughts on this as well before we move on. Again, Helmut, same question to you. Of these technologies, which do you find to be the most promising? But I do want to add another angle to you, if you don't mind. What do you think the challenges are? Obviously, you advise and consult governments and key stakeholders on creating these visions for the future. So what would you say the challenges are? I mean, obviously, some of these things are 20 years away, some of them are 30 years away. How can we really plan for things that we don't quite know how exactly they'll come to be? Or do you think it's just a matter of time, not a matter of if?
No, thanks, Maya. I think let's take it one by one. Maybe a quick view on my perspective on what will change the transportation world here in the region in the next 10 years, mostly. I think that from my perspective, let's highlight three main topics. The first one will be shared, connected, multimodal mobility. So as you can see in the region, the buildup of full urban transit systems is fully in the process, right? Dubai started that 2005 and has done actually an amazing journey since then to build up almost all transport modes you can have. And other cities are clearly embarking on that because it's a necessity that you have functioning mass transit system. Yeah. And that with today's technology, we discussed this before, in a seamless multimodal experience where people are going away from pure individual transportation and own transportation is a key driver, and that is there. The infrastructure, which Derek mentioned, right, is there. So it's about how do I use that infrastructure best? Yeah, I need to add metros, yeah, of course, as a core backbone for these urban transit systems, but that's going to be, or that's in the process, right? So Riyadh is working on that. Abu Dhabi is working on that, and other cities are working on that too. So this will be a first big change in the transportation world of people, away from a pure car-driven, car-centric mobility. The second key point will be rail. So far, we have rail in the kingdom. We have a small rail in the UAE, but that's expanding too. And that's even beyond the next 10 years. That's on a 10 to 20-year perspective. But that will, again, same like the metro systems in city, if we talk about intercity travel, option that will allow new options. And that is core backbones that you see in Europe very clearly, right? So, but that's in that sense a certain catch-up with that transportation mode. And a third core trend, which will also come and swap over, is electric mobility across all modes. That is from buses to cars. Also, let's not forget logistics to trucks. I mean, this is touching some part which Dr. Farhan with Mohammed mentioned, the sustainability angle. And that's partially driven also significantly in the kingdom. All the new projects that are developed, the mega projects, have very clear ambition levels to be zero carbon transportation environments, right? And that's exactly the right thing to do, to drive that in right from the beginning into that direction. So these, I would say, are the more short-term core trends, which will change the transportation environment in the region. We talked about autonomous and aviation, or let's say aerial taxis. So these are two areas, and we can maybe talk here about challenges also more in that. A lot of was mentioned partially, problems in terms of the autonomous vehicles, but by the way, also a bit in terms of the electric vehicles, is the infrastructure and the whole generation of a regulatory environment. So first of all, if you want to have autonomous traffic on an individual level, in a city, that is a huge task, right? From a technological perspective, that's not just working like that. And hence, even if you would have autonomous vehicles in coming soon, then this is going to be a combined environment. And it's going to be a combined environment for the next 30 to 40 years. It's a dual system. It's not just one switch. It's not going to, from today, going from individual and to then autonomous. This is a long-term transition road, and that's not that easy to generate, because that requires the public transport operators and the regulatories to work clearly in that direction. There is a lot happening depending on the cities with different efforts. Some cities have laid clear aspiration. Dubai wants to have 25% of the traffic in autonomous ways by 2030. Others are following. So that's there. But of course, that doesn't go overnight, because there is a multitude of stakeholders, a multitude of technologies, and a whole infrastructure to be built. That doesn't go that easy. On the electric vehicles, we heard that too. It's very important to have the charging infrastructure, right? I mean, Germany, for example, now currently the new cars, the share of new cars in electric vehicles is now 12%. That's quite remarkable. And that'll be growing. As Derek mentioned, the UK actually postulated now to have only electric vehicles sold after 2030. So that trend also is clearly there, but this comes also with the necessity to build the charging infrastructure, the fuel. We were talking about data before as a fuel. So here we talk about the electricity of the fuel. And in terms of sustainability, let's not forget only the charging infrastructure, but again, also the backbone. How do you produce that energy in a sustainable way? That's the second aspect, which is also an important one that you need to think about, and which will create challenges, because switching from fuel-based powertrains to electric-based powertrains still needs energy. And if you generate that energy, then with, let's say, coal mines, sometimes in Europe, that's not helping, right? So that's a challenge here. Maybe last point, because I think the audience has a lot of questions. We want to go to that. Aerial taxis and aerial, let's say, urban aerial mobility is a clear trend, as has also seen several trials, etc. Here, again, infrastructure needs to be built. I mean, just think about where will all these aerial taxis land. Then there's a massive regulatory aspect towards that. Who is allowed to do this? Is it individual, commercial only? What are the regulatory aspects to that? It most likely will not be a full mass system, right? I mean, if you look at the latest research, it points out to, let's say, having around 150 to 200,000 aerial taxis by 2050. So that's marginal if I look at the total volume of cars on the roads, right? And even if, let's say, whatever, 80 to $100 billion revenues in that industry is also interesting, but it's a complementary effect that will try to alleviate some of the issues that we have in cities with congestion. But that's not solving that, right? You will not have the amount of aerial taxis, because otherwise you would just push what you have on the roads with individual cars to the air. Well, you have more lanes in the air than on the road, right? That problem you not have, but still then you would have a very congested airspace. So the key point, really going back to that again, will be to create full-blown urban transit systems that allow a seamless multimodal experience for customers, so that the shared mobility becomes more and more reality.
Makes sense. So ground-based travel is here to stay, and I suppose if we're talking about layered travel rather than going into the air, we're more likely to go underground using tunnels and hyperloop systems. Then that would be your final verdict, right, Helmut?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's a key backbone of the system.
Great. We're a bit behind schedule for sure, but I just want to take 5 to 10 minutes more if everyone doesn't mind, just to quickly go over a few questions. I'll do these in lightning round style just to get an answer to everything as much as we can. So I'll ask this to the full panel. Feel free to jump in, anyone. This is a few different questions we got from a few different people, and I'll just kind of converge them into one big question. And it goes well with what we were going to discuss as a third question anyway, which is with a large population of millennials and young Saudis currently, living in the kingdom, how can we incentivize these people to use more sustainable modes of transportation, whether that is electric vehicles, and of course that requires infrastructure, or if it's using public transportation when the Riyadh Metro is finalized and when the Jeddah Metro is finalized as well, or if it's something else altogether to maybe use more bicycles and whatnot, if it's sort of personal and mass transit functional framework needs to come to play to bring in less car-centric models into the kingdom. What is everyone's thoughts? How can we incentivize essentially people to use sustainable transportation models? Jump in. I'll let anyone go here.
Well, typical models, maybe if I'll do a quick starting round, what you can do, of course, and what's done in Europe is, if you talk about electric vehicles, there is on the one side subsidies provided for the purchase of electric vehicles. So that's one angle which you can do. On the other side, it's the provision of free electric charging stations, right? So that also drives down your cost in terms of fueling up. These are two quite simple and tangible measures which end up in the pockets of the customers, which drive them towards what I just mentioned, the buying new cars instead of ICE cars, basically buying electric vehicles.
Your thoughts? Go ahead.
Okay,
so
go ahead, I feel that congestion pricing is still a new concept in GCC, and it's not seen as much. Plus, it could be, that the entire process could provide subsidies to public transport users, which could be in terms of at the time of employment contracts, some subsidies could be offered to the new employees or regular employees. That should be part of the commercial setup or large employers which are attracting a lot of trips. And in addition, for example, the universities and other areas where young population is predominantly using their own cars, I think the setup could be arranged for subsidized or maybe in some cases free travel on transport system during the peak periods at least. And there is an operating cost side of it as well, unfortunately, where the fuel is too economical in Gulf countries, and that's another side of equation which weighs heavily on attitudes of driving instead of using public transport. So there could be some strategies done there on that part as well. So on overall, there needs to be a holistic approach where we include many disruptive interventions, I must say, to attract young group of drivers towards intermodal system. And of course, it also depends on what is being offered. What kind of services are being offered? Are they attractive to those?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Absolutely. Mohammed, I think this is a core point.
If you don't offer those services, for example, it will not attract them, and they will never come to public transport. They will always use their car. Many factors could play a role. For example, I'll be very quick now. For example, how many transfers, how easy it is for them to get on the public transport systems or electric vehicle, to use electric vehicle or alternative vehicle. I remember in US, during my time in US, I remember there was tax incentives for buying electric vehicles. That's an excellent idea for people who are buying electric vehicle, maybe on the registration and overall tax incentive to people. So these kind of strategies, if combined together, could help attract a lot of intermodal users.
Can I, if I may just come in on incentivization, I think we need to look at it. Maybe those are sort of almost immediate short-term incentives, right? What we need to also look at is what is the long-term picture and what are the long-term incentives, and look at it much more on a strategic basis, because we are working on a time frame. As the kingdom diversifies, as the kingdom changes, as the kingdom builds towards a new society, I think we need to understand what that means. And what incentivization means to me is the ability to create opportunity. And what does that mean? It means that for millennials coming through, what are their aspirations? What are their expectations? And what systems are we going to be planning to enable them to actually meet and address those? And so for me, it's not just about immediate incentives, but it's actually creating almost a new ecosystem on the back of some of the work that we've just discussed. And what that means is the ability to create innovation centers, knowledge centers, opportunities. I mean, McKinsey were working with us, and they did a part of the work they did was to look at the socioeconomic benefits that spin out and that assist diversification, because they sometimes get overlooked. We tend to focus so much on the mobility solution that we forget about what the bigger picture is. And that bigger picture is really about creating a whole new economy and a whole new society. And then on the back of that, whatever we are planning for the next 100 years needs to be sustainable, it needs to be environmentally friendly, and it needs to be affordable. So when we start looking at Hyperloop and we start looking at Hyperloop systems for the KSA, we are looking at not a short horizon, but we're looking at the next 10, 20, 30-year horizon. And the ability to create a whole ecosystem that creates manufacturing in high-tech engineering and high-tech components, the ability to be able to become a leader in new transportation technologies are all huge incentives for everyone. And I think I'd just like to sort of leave that thought out there.
Can I just build off of this on one element? Because I totally agree, by the way, about all the incentives and the stuff that's being done with electric cars. But one of the big shifts, and Raj, maybe Raj actually sort of hit on it a little bit, and that was around this sort of shift towards meta-economics or humanistic economics. That's a totally different area. And what we're beginning to see with relationship to that is this massive decentralization, right? And new formats. I mean, starting with Uber and stuff. But what we've actually begun to see now is a lot more ride sourcing, so that young people actually look for rides to go places. So we have lots and lots of systems whereby you can just look up if someone's going wherever you want to go on a certain time and you go with them. Now, I used to think that was sort of for ethical reasons, for sustainability reasons, but actually it's just because it's for two reasons, predominantly, apparently, according to the people who do it. One is because it's nice to have company, and two, because it's a cost-sharing situation for younger people. And, I think that it's become really, really popular and really safe. It's a bit like sort of hitchhiking, but in a very well-organized, structured way. And as far as I know, there haven't been any issues. And this is a very common way in which students today are traveling between cities in particular and around cities, in fact.
I think one of the speakers, I don't remember if it was last year or in one of the previous editions, talked about gamification theory and how that relates to millennials as well. And so generally speaking, when it comes to incentives, people think about punishment and reward systems, especially financial. But for millennials, it has continuously been proven that a reward system that is non-financial, especially if it has something to do with the user journey, is actually much more likely to succeed. So something to think about as well is maybe it doesn't have to be just about cheaper fares and easier access, but how they experience that. I mean, for example, if you have Wi-Fi in the tube in the UK, more people would use it. People do use it a lot, but I feel like something like that is so important to millennials that these little things here and there actually will probably make more of a difference than any financial incentive ever could. We're out of time, so any final thoughts, quick few sentence thoughts? I want to get everyone the chance to say a few more words. Helmut, let's go with you first.
Well, I think we've discussed various technologies. I would conclude with the fact it's fascinating times, right? If you think about the changes in transportation and mobility that happened, let's say, between 1910 or 1920, whenever you would consider the car to be a, let's say, fully applied methodology, up until the early 2000s, that has by far not seen what we've seen in the last 20 years, and that will expedite, right? So it is a great time, and it's amazing to see what's happening with technology. IT, as we said, I think that's for me, again, a core takeaways from discussion and data, that is the middle of it, that's the motor and the fuel, and that will stay.
Data is the fuel is going to be my quote for this webinar. So I'll put that up there in the hashtags for sure. Dr. Farhan, how about yourself? What are your thoughts?
Look, this has been an amazing talk and amazing discussion that we have done here. And I believe that Saudi Arabia in particular is lucky to have Vision 2030. It presents a remarkable opportunity for Saudi Arabia to embark on this journey for transformation. And it presents many good opportunities, by the way, in terms of digital transformation, mobility, healthcare, fintech. You talk about the avenue and it's there. Now,
I think the doctor's having
the approach in terms of capacity building, in terms of provision of phased approach towards how we transform to these new technologies. I would be happy in the next few years if I see any regional transportation plans by the ministry or municipalities, including these technologies as part of Vision 2030 effort, in alignment of Vision 2030, include these new technologies. For example, Hyperloop is an amazing technology. And I would be happy to see it has been earmarked. But, if we could see, these technologies in brochures and in flyers and not in the real planning projects, it doesn't mean anything to me. So my wish is that these amazing new technologies of electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, Hyperloop, and much more, we need to see them in the phased planning efforts in the long-term plans. Otherwise, we could just talk about for years and years and not achieve anything. So that's my fear, and that's my hope that we go in that direction.
Thank you, Doctor. There you go, Harj. You got an engaged stakeholder from Aramco chair now. What else could you ask for?
I'm going to address that myself and elaborate more because we're doing a lot of work in the kingdom, and just to the point Professor Farhan makes about being formally adopted and to be actually part of the long-term planning is a very, very valid point. Because you can't do these things without looking at what those national transport strategies look like. And on that front, I'm happy to announce that we are part of the national logistics strategy for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the work that we are doing with the Ministry of Transport and the TGA. So it's exactly those sort of things that are essential to enable technologies like us to go forward. I think I would like to leave on a note, and that is a thought out there. And I think a lot of the audience would have heard about the 15-minute concept for city planning, and the term amenity densification.
Mm.
It was brought about by the mayor of Paris, but 15 minutes, when time and distance is no longer a barrier, and you've got hyperloop technologies like ours, what does that mean as we go forward? Because it changes everything. And I would just like to hand over to the panel, but that's
Great.
the thought I would like to leave with.
Well, all I can say is that the next, well, when the test for Hyperloop comes to Middle East and India, I'd like for you to consider me as one of the happy test subjects.
That's a good point. Before I just to sort of go off, I would just like to say that timeframes is important. We are looking at a Hyperloop system ready for passenger use within the next decade, certification by the next 5-6 years. So I think just to put that into context, it's not a long time away. Great.
Glad to hear it. Derek, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that my final thoughts on this really are that one has to look at this whole, story, the positives and the challenges, much more from an interconnected perspective. I think that transportation per se is incredibly important. Obviously, it's a big part, but we need to see how it interconnects with smart manufacturing, the future work sphere, where we're going to work, where we're going to learn in future, changing economic systems. I mentioned it earlier, more movement towards humanistic economics, what we call the remix societies. So we live different lives. We've already, we do share things. We've expected to be different. We have different anchors and different relationships. And all these things really, are critical as to how we ultimately deliver a sustainable and resilient transportation system. We're not building a transportation system that is literally just the best at physically transporting people. It's about improving our lifestyles, everyone's lifestyle, and about providing, safety, security, and well-being to everyone. And I think that we have to look at it through that lens. And, despite the fact that I spend a lot of my life on understanding how all these technologies work and where they can go and how do we optimize them and make them, and integrate them, at the end of the day, societies, per se, is probably, where I would be my start point and move back. And I think a number of people have said, yeah, what it does for the human is pretty critical. And bear in mind, it will not only just be what is done for the human. As we move forward, we're moving into maybe past a fully human-centric society into a human-machine integrated centric society, and these things will be seen working together, and we'll have much more of a what we call intelligibility between human machines as we move this forward. So that's where I'd leave this. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Derek. You set the stage perfectly for a whole different discussion of topics. I wish we had the time. I do appreciate all four of you for staying so much past the deadline. Thank you for being with us. A pleasure to have you. Thank you to all the audience for joining us, for asking your questions. I am very sorry we didn't get the chance to go over all of them. I will try to get back to each of you with these answers later on, though, if we can manage that. But for now, a massive thank you to the panel for being with us here today. Professor Derek Woodgate, thank you so much for joining us again, and it's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been wonderful. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Very, very good panel, by the way. Lots of great topics and a lot of good things we think about.
Couldn't agree more.
As I go to lunch.
Enjoy your lunch. Thank you so much. Dr. Mohammed Farhan, thank you so much for joining us as well. It's always a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mayur. It was amazing discussion, and I hope that discussion continues on. Beyond this webinar to actual stakeholders, and we do see some implementations and good transformations, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Harj, as well, thank you so much for joining us with the Virgin Hyperloop logo even more succinctly visible now. And just remember, you did promise me one of those test drives, so I'm going to hold you to that.
Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me along to the panel. I think it's been absolutely a great panel, great topics, and I just, disappointed we've just run out of time. I would love to have carried on, but maybe another time. Thank you very much.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Arj. And last but definitely not least, Helmut, thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you with us, and definitely going to have you with us again in the future. I hope I'll just do my best
Likewise.
to squeeze even more out of your time.
Absolutely.
So
likewise, pleasure, and I look very much forward to the next panel. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
You too. Thank you so much, Helmut, and thank you all for joining us again. This was Mahir Brahimi from the Saudi Transport Conference. Thank you for being with us today. I hope you can join us in future events. Once again, if you could take the 30 seconds to respond to the post-webinar survey, that will go a long way in helping us plan for future events. Without further ado, I appreciate your time. Good afternoon. Goodbye.